been positive. Sanctioned camping, we've worked with a Home for Everyone to develop a framework for outdoor shelters that would be managed by a nonprofit organization. And then the high intensity street engagement program. This is intensive street outreach coupled with neighborhood response teams and public safety workers to move those with the highest barriers to service into housing. The program has successfully assisted 90 individuals and 80 households into housing placement services, and 52 individuals and 38 households have moved to permanent housing. And then lastly, in the 2015-2016 budget year, we funded a Home for Everyone. So with that, I want to provide that lay of the land, that landscape for you, and some of the things that we've done in the first year. And we do have a number of people to testify, and after me will be Chair Kafoury.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. Chair Kafoury.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for allowing me to speak with you today. I'm here to express my support for the extension of a 1 year on the housing state of emergency. And I want to briefly talk about the work the city and the county are doing together to expand shelter, streamline homeless services, and to get thousands of people into permanent housing. But I think the most important voices that we are going to hear from today will be those people who are experiencing homelessness or those who have overcome it. Because it is the trauma of that experience, I believe, that causes us to recognize that as long as we have men, women, and children in our community sleeping on our streets, we need to recognize that we have an emergency and do everything within our power to help. To that end, Multnomah County is working very closely with the City of Portland to expand shelter beds throughout our community. I heard a little bit from Chad about what has been done, but I think it's important to realize how many beds we've opened recently, very recently. In February, we expanded our 130-bed family shelter. We opened it in a former strip club in Southeast Portland, turning a neighborhood vice into a safe, welcoming place for families. This shelter has a no turn-away policy, meaning that any family in our community that seeks shelter will find it. In July, we added 200 beds at the Hanson shelter and another 25 beds at a new shelter for veterans. And this fall, we will open 210 additional beds, 120 at the McLaughlin Couple Shelter and 90 at a new shelter for women in Gresham. Together, that's 475 safe new shelter beds. Obviously, that is not enough, and our work is not done. But I'm also proud of the collaboration in creating the Joint Office of Homeless Services. For years, the City of Portland was responsible for homeless individuals, and the county was responsible for homeless families. And I'm sure, like many of you, that division didn't make any sense to me. If a single mother was trying to find a warm, dry place for her child to sleep, she doesn't care which government is responsible for helping her. She just needs the help. So now we have a Joint Office of Homeless Services housed at Multnomah County. Clarifying our roles as public servants is as important as our deep partnership. While the Joint Office focuses on the housing placement and wraparound services that people need to get off the streets, that work cannot succeed without the city's work to increase the number of affordable units in our community. Together, we've been able to advance our plan to address homelessness through a Home for Everyone, our county-wide coalition of people who have experienced homelessness, nonprofit agencies, business and faith leaders. The emergency on our streets is not over, but the action that you are taking today will help us respond with care, compassion, and speed. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Kafoury.
May I ask a question,
Yes.
please? Thank you for being here, Chair Kafoury. We know that the Director of the Joint Office reports directly to you. Are you comfortable with the changing in the language to require the Director of the Joint Office to report every 6 months to the Council?
Yes, definitely, and I hope that he is as responsive to your needs and concerns as he can be. So 6 months seems like a long time, but yes.
Thank you.
Chair, could I just address something you said about clarifying our roles? In my office, it's called Stay in Your Lane. And we are very proud of this new partnership, and we're still working out the details. It means I think this council is deeply committed to getting these 6-month reports. And I'm glad Commissioner Fritz just mentioned that. What I sometimes feel is missing in some of our debates, and it's a fast-moving process, is having clarity about whether an issue that we're taking up has been reviewed and or approved by the Home for Everyone steering committee. And second, whether the action falls within the framework of the plan that you have hammered out. And I'll just give you an example of where it's, I think, worked effectively. At budget time. And at budget time, you've come forward and others and laid out a plan and the framework for addressing the housing crisis. And we've made budget decisions based on that. And in some instances, you've even challenged us to make commitments above our resources. So that I think has been very productive. What's not always clear to me is where does an action before us fit within the plan, and has it been blessed by the Home for Everyone? So I don't expect you to have necessarily an answer today, but as we continue to develop and deepen the relationship, I'd like that to become as routine as we do, let's say, in an item that comes to council where we see what kind of community consultation has there been, and has a neighborhood association been contacted, and the like. I would like this to be as routine as the way we handle other community consultations.
Thank you, and I appreciate that. I think that's one of the reasons why I am here today, to let you know personally from me, my support for this and Multnomah County's support. And realizing that there is always going to be challenges moving forward, that each one of us is independently elected, and so we have our own constituencies that we are listening to. And also I think sometimes the speed that we're trying to address things, going through a bureaucratic maze, is not always going to be the best route, but that's why communication is of the most importance.
Thank you again, Chair Kafori.
Thank you.
So next we'll bring up Housing Director, Portland Housing Director Kurt Krieger, and Mark Jolan, who is Director of the Joint Office of Homeless Services, as well as the Home for Everyone Coordinator. Executive Director. I'll start with you, Mark.
Okay. Good afternoon, Mayor and members of City Council. My name is Mark Jolan. I'm with the Home for Everyone, and I am the director of the recently formed Joint Office of Homeless Services. A year ago, when you declared a state of emergency in housing and homelessness, you recognized the crisis that tens of thousands of people in our community are facing every day. You recognized that our local economy, which has improved circumstances for many, has created serious hardship for others. Unprecedented demand for rental housing and lagging supply have caused annual double-digit increases in rents at the same time that the real value of wages for the lowest income households in our community has stagnated. This combination has pushed thousands of families to the brink of homelessness, and many are going over the edge, finding themselves living in dangerously doubled up situations in shelters, in parks, and in vehicles all around the city. The declaration of the state of emergency galvanized our community to respond to the crisis in a way that is unprecedented in my experience. As Chad laid out in greater detail, the declaration was the foundation for a series of new and accelerated strategies designed to address the emergency on multiple fronts. To accelerate the creation of affordable housing, to expand financial and legal protections for tenants to prevent them from losing their housing, to expand the safe spaces, shelter spaces for people who become homeless, and to significantly expand programs to help people who are experiencing homelessness get back into housing and keep that housing. Many of these are long-term strategies already laid out in the action plan for Home for Everyone, our unified community plan to end homelessness. But in the face of the emergency, this council, joined by the County Commission, Home Forward, and scores of community partners, committed to dramatically accelerating the implementation of these strategies. We are now in the midst of that implementation, and the indicators that led you to declare a state of emergency are still very much present. Portland continues to have among the fastest growing housing prices in the country and among the nation's lowest vacancy rates. The Portland Tribune reported in March that Portland saw a 14% increase in the average rent for a one-bedroom apartment to over $1,300 a month, the highest percentage increase of any city in the country. These increases far outpace any gains in income for low-wage households and leave people on fixed incomes, like Social Security disability, unable to maintain the housing they have, and if they are already homeless, unable to find a place they can afford. These trends, along with the continued lack of prioritization at the federal level of affordable housing development, income supports, and services for vulnerable populations, explain why 211 Info Our community's information referral line reports that they have taken more than 21,000 calls for shelter and housing-related services since the beginning of the state of emergency, including an average of 1,300 calls a month from people who self-identify as homeless. Calls for housing and shelter services to 211 have gone from 35% of their call volume to 50% of their call volume in just the last 3 years. It's also why between December of 2015 and June of 2016, the average number of nightly residents at our Human Solutions No Turn Away Family Shelter increased from 116 people per night to 146 people per night, an increase of almost 30% over just 7 months. It's why Transition Projects has 1,000 people on their adult shelter waiting list, including 300 women, and why visits to their day center are up 17% over what they were 2 years ago. And overall, our publicly funded shelter providers reported that from July 2015 through June of 2016, almost 6,000 people accessed emergency shelter, nearly a 50% increase over the last 3 years. And that number doesn't count the people who sought shelter at Portland Rescue Mission, City Team Ministries, and in places like Dignity Village and Right to Dream 2. Unfortunately, the data also suggests that the vast majority of people who enter shelter are not able to exit shelter to permanent housing because we have such a desperate shortage of available affordable units for our lowest income residents. That is why when Home Forward opened its public housing waiting lists earlier this summer, over 8,000 people submitted over 22,000 applications just to get on the waiting lists for various buildings. As these statistics indicate, there is no question that for tens of thousands of Portlanders who are homeless or in housing crisis today, the emergency is real and ongoing. Your decision to extend the state of emergency will help sustain the critical momentum we have to implement policies and expand program capacity to help them through this crisis. On the shelter front, as you've heard, we committed to achieving the Home for Everyone goal to increase shelter options by at least 650 beds, more than doubling the publicly supported shelter capacity in our community by the end of fiscal year 2017. With the flexibility and new resources allocated during this year under the state of emergency, we're on track to achieve this goal, but there is a lot of continued effort, investment, and code reform needed to finish the job and sustain our progress. As important as shelter is as one part of our response to this emergency, we will only truly address the crisis if we significantly decrease the number of people who are losing their housing and becoming homeless, and if we dramatically increase our capacity to help people move out of shelter and back into permanent housing. With the declaration of the state of emergency, we committed to achieving the ambitious Home for Everyone goals of having programs in place by the end of 2017 to prevent at least 5,000 people a year from becoming homeless, and helping at least 4,350 people a year move off the streets and back into permanent housing. We've begun to build that program capacity and scale up resources to achieve these outcomes, but we've only begun. And beyond expanded homeless prevention and housing placement services, we need to continue the focus that the state of emergency has brought to rapidly increasing the supply of affordable housing units. Our ending homelessness strategies depend on significantly increasing the supply of deeply affordable and permanent supportive housing, and Director Krieger will speak to these efforts. We see daily in the faces of the people in our shelters, on our streets, and in our eviction courtrooms the human toll of this housing crisis. Under the state of emergency, we are moving critical long-term strategies and investments forward at an unprecedented rate. In doing so, we are helping tens of thousands of people a year, and we are also setting an example for our state and federal partners, without whom we will not be able to truly resolve this crisis. Thank you.
Mark, I talk to people periodically who just don't believe that people are homeless because housing prices are rising. They understand housing prices are rising, they understand people are homeless, but they just refuse to believe there is much of a connection. And I think there is a connection, but I'd love to have more statistics to give them to say, for example, here's what percentage of people who are homeless now are people who had a home a year ago, but their rents went up and they couldn't find another place. So, actually, I think I asked you that a while ago, so you didn't have the numbers offhand. I was curious about that.
So we don't have we don't have the data parsed out in that particular way. So in the street count that we'll do in January, in part because you've asked this question, we'll be incorporating the kind of primary causality questions. I think we know from our providers, we know, for example, from our family shelter providers that a significant majority of the families they're seeing are reporting that they're homeless for the first time, that the cause of their homelessness was very much an economic crisis. We know from our providers that are trying to help people find housing that if someone is on less than $800 a month in long-term disability and rents for one-bedroom apartments of $1,300, that financial piece is an essential barrier to their ability to get back into housing. What we also know is if there's a housing unit available that someone can afford, we can provide the support services to help them stay housed. If they don't have the money to pay the rent, all the support services in the world will not keep them in housing. And that's just fundamentally what's at stake.
Okay, I really appreciate getting more of a breakdown in January. I should also note that the Tribune did a poll on housing affordability and homelessness a few weeks ago, and I think that their data with people in the metro area also showed that a lot of people think the primary reason for homelessness is unemployment or mental health issues and a number of issues, that not very many of them thought was simply the rising cost of housing. So it's not just anecdotal, it appears to be there's a number of people in the metro area, the general public, who would like to know that.
Sure. Yeah. And the causes are interwoven, right? Because there may be a variety of reasons why someone is struggling to earn an income that would allow them to pay the rent. But we also know that rents are escalating to the point now where someone who is working full-time in a minimum wage job still can't afford the rent. So I think the financial piece will always have to be a contributing cause, and why someone is struggling to have the income that they would need to pay the rent is going to be specific to their circumstance. But right now, the rents are beyond what even folks who are able to find full-time work can afford to make.
Mark, I have a comment and question. I wholeheartedly agree with what you said, that long-term, the solution to this crisis is expanding the supply of affordable homes. In the short term, we made a commitment to expand our shelter capacity because we believe that a shelter is a better and safer place in some instances than being on the street. But that's not our long-term plan. Shelter is just a piece of the plan. Can you just very briefly explain to us how a one-year extension versus what we were initially, I think, the default was going to be, which was a 6-month extension. How does a one-year extension strengthen your hand in terms of finding available shelter space over the next year?
So I think in part what the state of emergency and certainly having another year of it sustains that intensive focus that the state of emergency declaration has brought to this effort. As we go out to look for spaces for shelter, the ability to make a year-long commitment to a space. So there's a level of certainty there. Whenever we identify a shelter site, it's going to require some level of financial investments in program development, and the more sustainable that shelter is, the more cost-effective those investments become. So we're looking at that opportunity to not only expand, but then also do the work of stabilizing the shelters over time that are not just temporary, that we expect to have as permanent shelters.
So could I ask a follow-up question about that? How many of the shelters that we've opened have used the state of emergency to waive elements of the zoning code?
So the shelters we've been able to expand in the last year have all taken advantage of the sort of temporary use provisions that are allowed under the code. So the state of emergency becomes a platform for that. It allows for the continuation of that temporary use.
For longer than 6 months.
Right.
So I'm wondering if we need a further amendment in the substitute, because it says that the council waives all applicable provisions of Title 33 other than the temporary general regulations to allow the city to site up to 5 day storage units in several locations. So we've actually waived everything except the temporary activities of some shelters too, right?
So I'm not trying to follow the question. It may be a question for the city attorney rather than for me. I don't know what is required in terms of the provisions of the ordinance. In that
Part of
sense.
my understanding is that we need to extend the state of emergency to allow the shelters to continue to operate. And I'm wondering if the previous ordinance also had something about we're just waiving the zoning code for storage facilities. So I'm wondering where it gets to, we can do this in a longer term basis. Maybe taking the direction to approve it in this case. I'm just trying to figure out how does the state of emergency affect the zoning code and temporary activities.
So again, so my understanding is that the state of emergency allows us to, there's a presumption of daily being able to allow us to continue the temporary use to stabilize those shelters.
Okay, so it's possible that city attorneys might need to advise us on putting that in black and white in the ordinance. Thank you.
Director Krieger.
Good afternoon, members of council, and Mayor Hales by phone. Kurt Krieger, Director of the Housing Bureau. I'd like to speak to some of the permanent housing aspects of your emergency declaration and speak specifically in support of the substitute ordinance that has been proffered. Specifically, I'd like to mention the GATOR, the so-called Governmental Accountability and Transparency Review process that was launched by Mayor Hales and Commissioner Salzman. Since we were increasing the available funding for housing development and housing preservation, we needed to make process improvements to the way in which PBOT, the Bureau of Development Services, the Housing Bureau work together with Planning and Sustainability to compress the time of permit approval. And the GATOR process is the means by which that has come about in the last 6 months. It was specifically convened in response to the state of emergency, and the directors of our sister bureaus were all convened by the mayor and Commissioner Salzman to identify ways in which we could tangibly shorten the period of time from project application to project approval. And I'd like to say that we are making good progress in that regard. For instance, simple things that really have been helpful is that the 8 newly funded projects in the so-called NOFA, the Notice of Funding Availability, as the applicant applies for their permits, the Housing Bureau is listed as a co-applicant. So we're on the front sheet of the permit application as the Housing Bureau, which signals to the Bureau of Development Services that that project will receive priorities processing. The allocation of resources inside of BDS is a daily optimization effort, and housing is getting priority treatment as a result. I think we will see tangible results. However, it's early in that process, so I can't report yet what they are, but we're looking for months, not days, of savings. The other thing I'd like to speak to is the design review improvements that are embedded in your emergency declaration. Up till the state of emergency, projects that went through a Type 3 were often stuck in an interminable loop of review by the design commission. The Type 2X process was a way by which to short circuit and compress the time needed to make sure the project met City of Portland design standards. The Type 2X process is currently designed as a staff review appealable to the design commission. And we have 2 projects that are preparing to submit for a review under that new auspices. It's taken a few months because they have to prepare working drawings for their projects to get to this point. But specifically, River Place Parcel 3 by Bridge Housing and Raleigh at 14th and Raleigh by Innovative Housing Inc. are coming forward to utilize that new process improvement. Third, I'd like to say that in large part,